friends.
Hello and welcome to today's NACC webinar entitled How to Speed Read a Research Article, a Beginner's Guide to Research Competency. And our presenter today is LaVera Crawley, MD, MPH. Thank you very much, LaVera, for agreeing to do this session for us today. We are very appreciative, and I'm sure anyone who accesses the recording will learn a lot from you. Just a brief introduction. LaVera Crawley joined NACC in 2011 and is an ACPE Associate Certified Educator. She has served on the NACC Research Task Force and is now on the NACC Research Advisory Panel. For more than 30 years, LaVera has had successful careers in medicine and ethics and academic research in health disparities in end-of-life care, for which she received national and international recognition. LaVera received her MD from Meharry Medical College, completed her family medicine residency and chief residency at UCSF, her MPH from UC Berkeley, an ethics fellowship at Stanford, and a palliative care education fellowship at Harvard. Along with her CPE supervisory work, she also serves on the palliative care team at the Alta Bates campus. As a Catholic laywoman, LaVera is involved with Franciscan organizations, including the Center for Action in Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she serves on their board of directors. And with that, LaVera, I am turning the mic over to you.
Thank you, and welcome. It is my prayer that this webinar give you the confidence in your understanding, your accessing, and your being able to apply findings from research literature, and in turn allow you to demonstrate your competency in articulating how primary research and research literature can inform the profession of chaplaincy and your own spiritual care practice. So I'd like to use sort of the metaphor of us journeying together. Let's say we're taking a road trip. And you can see it's not a straight journey. We'll take some side trips. But we'll begin with asking ourselves, well, what is this thing called research, and what are different kinds of research? It's not just one thing. And then once you understand what research is, where do you find it? Where does that research live? Where does it reside? And once you can find where it is, how do you actually get your hand on an article that you can read? By the time we get through this journey and towards its end, you're going to find that, oh my goodness, there's so many articles. How do I keep up? And then once you have figured that out, it's like, then what? So again, the whole purpose of the journey is to get us to the place where we can integrate research findings into your spiritual care practice, and of course, for certification purposes, to demonstrate that competency. So here are the objectives that were really represented on that roadmap. And the first three really are instrumental. They're giving you some ideas, how to think about things, how to go find things, then how to speed read to be able to read articles quickly. All of those really are to teach you methods and practices to be able to integrate research into your practice. Again, also to be able to demonstrate your competency with that. So let's begin with the differences in types of research. And I'm going to limit this conversation today to two types, methods and levels of evidence. There are many different ways that we could talk about how research is done. There are different schools of thought. But this is the only two I think that we need as beginning our journey. The first is methods. So here's a table that we're going to come back to, but I want to spend a pretty fair amount of time going through it. Because I think it really lays a really solid foundation for anything else you need to think about in terms of what is research. So you can see we want to look at how different methods. I have 3 that are listed up here: qualitative, quantitative, and what I'm calling big data. There are others, and I'll point out some nuances between these and others. But these are 3 that I think, again, lays a good foundation for you to understand what the world of research is like nowadays. We'll look at how they differ across purpose, approach, and how you would collect the data. We'll take those 3 rows first. And then we'll look at the bottom 2 rows, which are interpersonal. It's where people are involved. So let's look at qualitative research. Its purpose is to discover ideas. And it does that by making observations and then making meaning of those observations, interpreting them. And what kind of things are they observing? Well, it's what we do on the bedside as chaplains, really. The data is considered unstructured. When you're getting someone's story, they're telling it their way. There's no real structure to how, formal structure, let's say, to how they're doing that. Yes, they may be guided by some of your questions, but they're free form telling you their story. So that's the way that qualitative research works. It's wanting to discover a new idea like, okay, this is interesting. I've never heard someone talk about hope like that. I wonder if this is a cultural issue or if this is something about a particular life experience. I'd like to talk to other people who've had those life experiences, see how they think about hope. And that's discovering new ideas. This is in contrast to quantitative research, which wants to take those ideas and then begin to make hypotheses about them, to be able to make predictions, to measure something. So the approach then would be to be measuring things about that. So we could create a scale about hope, and we could say that it's a scale on how much hope you have, and then use that to compare, does that predict something about how well someone will do after surgery? So we're going to measure and test things. Therefore, the data that's collected is structured. It's generally around some predetermined categories. So survey questions or biometrics, numbers that deal with the body like blood pressure or blood values of some sort. That's the difference between qualitative and quantitative. You're not going to try to make predictions about just an idea unless you are measuring things. And you are not going to try to make generalizations about ideas unless you've tested them. So some people combine these 2 methods, qualitative and quantitative, into a category called mixed methods. You may have heard of that. And so we would start off, say, with questions about hope and getting trying to see some patterns by collecting stories, and then developing a survey from what we learned from those stories and doing that, going back and forth and back and forth. And then we have big data. So that was qualitative, quantitative, and then a mixture of the 2, a combination of the qualitative and quantitative called mixed. There's this whole other behemoth of a method called big data, which when I first did a version of this webinar a few years ago, it was not in the media as much. Unless you knew about it, then you saw it everywhere. But now it's really crept right into our politics, everything. So what is big data? It is an enormous amount of data, generally generated by the Internet of Things, through social media, through any trace of a browser search we've done, through GPS, our phones, our texts, purchases that we've made. So much data that now and we want to be able to use all that large amounts of data that's being generated every minute. We want to be able to identify trends and patterns in order to predict outcomes. In marketing, they want to predict how much you might buy something else. Or in healthcare, they might want to predict your susceptibility to a disease because of a particular genetic pattern. Because the data is so large, the approach to it had to be very, very different. The old tools that were used in quantitative research just didn't work, did not work well enough. And so they needed new tools to handle that, and they do it through the various methods of visualizing the data. So data visualization is another buzzword you may begin hearing. And think about that. It's a new way of seeing. It's visualizing things. And it's being able to see things on a global scale or even in the infinitesimal genome that has billions of bits of information. Taking all of that and then visualizing it to be able to see patterns and to predict outcomes. So what that data comes, it's in the form of structured and unstructured, and it's just streaming data from all sorts of sources. So those are the sort of instrumental aspects of these different methods. Now let's talk about the people part. In qualitative research, you as researcher, you're intimately involved with the person who you are getting information from, you're getting data from. And as a result of that relational component, the results can be subjective. You're bringing yourself into, you're the one who's observing, you're the one wanting to make meaning. The sample sizes, so the people who are involved, how do we choose them? We call them sample sizes. So we're choosing people purposefully. Again, my example of hope, is there some life experience difference around people's understanding and the way they use or experience hope. And so I'm going to go look for people who have those life experiences. I'm going to be very purposeful in who I choose. And as a result, whatever I find is not going to be generalizable to a large population, particularly if it's just a small sample size. We're just trying to get new ideas, remember? As opposed to quantitative research, the researcher is uninvolved as an observer, or at least thought to be. And as a result, what they find is generally some objective thing. You're measuring something objectively, then you're reporting it objectively. The reason I do hesitate or qualify this idea of the uninvolved observer in quantitative is because there has been some subjectivity early on to decide what you're going to study in the first place, what you're looking to study, and the particular tools, that is surveys or measurement tools that you've chosen to use. Those also have some subjectivity to them. So as long as the researcher is aware of that and accounts for that, it could still fall under this general objectivity of results. The other thing is that the participants, you need a larger number, a much larger sample size that's scientifically chosen as opposed to purposefully chosen. That's the sort of randomly chosen, so that you can generalize the results. That is, the results can apply more widely. In big data, the researcher really has no involvement with the participants. They're just streaming data that's out there in the first place, and the results can be both subjective and objective. And because the participants are really data and not individuals, but those who are generating that data, for the most part, we are unaware that we even are participating in this. So this is the summary of ways of thinking about research. And in this webinar, we're going to look at some examples of one of these methods. In the other webinars, there will be other times to look at some of the other ones as well. So that was the methods. The second one I'd want to draw your attention to is the levels of clinical evidence. This is also what I was referring to as the other webinars. There was another webinar done on for NACC called Where's the Evidence, where we look at evidence-based practice. And this is the scaffolding, if you will, of how evidence-based medicine or practice, whatever the field is, evidence-based sciences, thinks about different kinds of research. There's the triangle, and the triangle has at its base clinical experience. So this would be my personal clinical experience, how I have been with patients when I walk in a room. Let's say that I walked into the room of a person with that particular life experience, and there was a way that I was able to engage them around issues of hope and gain some information about that. That's my clinical experience. Someone else could go into that room or a room with a patient similar to that and have a very different clinical experience. So as you can see, there's some value to having our clinical experience, but how generalizable is that? We also then can do a little better, perhaps, and ask expert opinion. But truth be told, expert opinion is, unless they are drawing from the higher up as a part of their expert opinion, if they're drawing from their clinical experience or years of practice, it is useful. We all rely on that to a certain extent, but how reliable is it in all cases? As a result, some have drawn together groups of cases, pulled together a lot of cases to begin looking at things that we can learn, taking that expert wisdom and now adding it to the real world of cases, and that's very useful as well. Certainly now we're increasing something as we're moving up this triangle. What we're increasing is robustness. How much more we can, how much more rigor does it have, the findings have as we move up the triangle. So now we're moving in the red zone, the observational studies. These are ways in which we're saying, well, if someone was exposed to a lot of smoke, we just had a terrible, in California, terrible series of forest fires that affected the air quality for hundreds and hundreds of miles for a long period of time. So people have been exposed to something. What's the long-term studies of that or impact of that? So they may study someone, these are the epidemiological studies, they'll follow people over time. Or they may compare those who were historically exposed to something to those who weren't. These are the observational studies and sort of the bread and butter of public health epidemiology. When I was first entering into the world of science, the blue zone, the randomized clinical trials or controlled trials, was considered the gold standard of research evidence. What randomized controlled trials are is that we are trying an experiment. Ideally and usually and prayerfully with ethical controls in place so that it's done well and safely. But we're going to compare someone who may have gotten, say for blood pressure, a new blood pressure medicine, someone who is on the standard treatment would be considered the control, and then someone who gets this new drug would be the experimental group, the test group, and then they compare results. And people are randomized into which particular part of the study they're in. Are they going to get the standard treatment or are they going to get the new treatment? This is a random, and they look at results. As long as the sample size is large enough, they can do some pretty good generalizations about, apply it generally, whatever they find from their studies. But what if we start pooling a lot of randomized control trials? Instead of just one trial that had 1,000 patients enrolled in the trial, what if we looked at 100 trials, each with 1,000 folks in them? So now our numbers are getting bigger, not big data level bigger, but bigger enough that we can start pooling the results of a larger number of studies. And that's where we've reached the pinnacle of this triangle, systematic reviews. So we've increased our robustness, and at the same time, we are decreasing our bias as we move up. Again, there's a webinar on evidence-based medicine, but that's useful, but we're going to come back to this further on in this presentation. So what I would like to invite you now is to consider taking a break. This would be a good time. I will from time to time invite you to take a break, to think about what we've just gone through. We've just looked at a variety of research types. This is also a good opportunity for me to invite you to consider going through this webinar with colleagues. And this would be a good time to work with your colleagues, checking any questions they may have, any experience that they have had with different types of research and their understanding of it. So I'm inviting a community practice here. So time to take a break. And if you're now back, we're going to go to the next objective, which is to, now we know a little bit of what research is. Now where does that research reside? The findings of research, where does it reside, and how can I get my hands on it? So again, if you are with your colleagues right now, if you're not alone in the room, maybe start thinking about and asking yourselves, among yourselves, what strategies you use if you were trying to find research literature. I'm going to pause just a minute to let you have that conversation. I'm going to offer you a few tips on things that you may already do and hopefully maybe something new for you to consider doing to be able to find where all that research resides. The first stop is try your professional organization. NACC has a research update in its column, so there's a good source from your professional organization. You could go to transformchaplaincy.org, which is a new offering that serves as a hub for research and training. They have ways of opportunities for you to identify new research. APC has its webinar journal club. These professional organizations may have their own journal clubs, publications, but their websites as well. So that's a way to find published articles. You can also find them at libraries and through librarians. I love this button that I found somewhere on the internet because the librarian is indeed the original search engine. I rely on librarians. Throughout my academic and research career, I could not do what I did without becoming very good friends with a librarian. Where do you find a library? Hopefully, you're blessed with a library right inside your hospital if you are a hospital-based chaplain. Or, if not, then you can look for nearby universities in where you live. You can always go and ask, could you get privileges to their holdings, as well as, it may cost. For example, I wanted to have access to our local GTU religious library, and so I pay a small fee for an annual capacity to have access to their library. You can also go to your alma mater where you graduated and see if they have alumni privileges. And of course, there's the local public library. Please do not underestimate it because it can they have access to these databases that we want to get to for finding articles. Now I'm going to talk about some tricks and tips that I think would be a very helpful practice for you to consider, and that is beginning to subscribe to table of contents alerts. So the steps would be finding some journals that are really relevant to the work that you do, and not just journals in chaplaincy, but let's say if you're in a palliative care chaplain, some of the nursing, social work, and medical palliative care journals. That's an example. So you want to identify a few of the top journals in your field. You want to go to the home page of these journals, and then you want to subscribe to their table of contents alert. This asterisk gives a reference to an article that was published several years ago, in 2011, in the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy that looked at journals that outside of general religious or chaplaincy type journals, they looked at other journals that tend to publish articles that are relevant to our work. So you might want to check that out. But here's how you would do that. Most professional journals provide an email service that alerts you whenever they have new content. I should also, it goes to say that every journal just about has a website. So you go to the website, and somewhere, everybody does it differently, but somewhere on that title page for that journal, they will have something that says alert me or email me or something that just tells you that they have that service. So click on that. In this case, I'm looking at the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy, and I click on it, and the drop-down menu that showed up here in this slide shows that I can get an email alert, and that's what I would choose. And then I get monthly, or whenever they have a new journal, sometimes even when they have an article before they've published it, I get an email that lets me know what's going to be in that journal, and I can look at the table of contents there. You can also do online searches. There's several ways of doing that. I've already talked about professional journals. So you could go to that website for a professional journal. Here we are back again at the Journal for Healthcare Chaplaincy. And somewhere on their page, they're going to have a search box. And at the top here, where you see the red arrow is an empty search box, but right below it, it says within this current journal or throughout the whole entire site. And so I could put my search term in there, click on it, and it will show me all the articles in that journal that are relevant to whatever I'm searching for. You can also then simply use a browser, a general search engine, but please beware. My recommendation is that if you're looking for professional research, excuse me, you want to use Google Scholar, not Google or Bing. And the basic reason is you want scholarly articles. There's so much more ad-driven results that come out in Google and Bing that you're sorting through mostly someone trying to get you to buy something. So that's not what you want. So I recommend that if you're going to use Google Scholar. Even better, actually the best, is to use a scholarly database. So now we're going to take a little side trip on our journey, as I want to talk to you a little bit about scholarly databases. The vast amounts of research literature that's out there is indexed and organized into searchable databases, which are usually subject or discipline specific. So for example, there's CINAHL, which is a nursing and allied health database. There's Medline, which is a medicine database. Some people aggregate these various different databases into a bundle. So one such bundle is called Ovid, another is PubMed. Some of these aggregated databases are free and some require subscription. So the fact that some require subscriptions is another very good reason to get to know your library and your librarian, because that library may actually have a subscription to some of those aggregated databases. The premier free aggregated database for medicine and healthcare is PubMed. It is produced by the National Library of Medicine, and it can be found at pubmed.gov. If you're unfamiliar with PubMed, the opening page gives you user guides and tutorials on how to use the site. And you can also go to YouTube and just search for videos for how to use PubMed, and there's several that are out there. I'd like to introduce you to another free database for medicine and healthcare, which is called TRIP, which stands for Turning Research into Practice. This is a more evidence-based database. And so, for example, let me show you how I use that. We're going to show you the PubMed example later on in this presentation. But for TRIP, I just typed the word spiritual in the search box. And at that time, it gave me 2,517 results. Now, by the way, I said it's free. It is, to use its bare bones. There are more bells and whistles available if you upgrade and pay. But in general, for the kinds of beginner research, I haven't bought a subscription yet. I have found them to be useful just in the parts that I can get for free. So I put in spiritual, and it gave me quite a number of articles. And what I want to point out is on the right side of their web page, they're telling me all about the articles. Now they're putting 2,570 in the search, but they're saying there are actually some more, and those are the ones that are probably not available because we don't have the bells and whistles. But they're organizing them. Look at the way they're organizing them. It may not be readable, so I'm going to read it out loud for you. It says that there's ones that are secondary evidence, there's ones for systematic reviews, there's ones for key primary research, and you may also notice on the left of that red circle, you're starting to see a little something. Perhaps it's not readable, but it's a little pyramid. Remember and this, I've blown it up for you. So for one of the articles, they put this little label next to it, evidence-based synopses with a green tip on a triangle. Does that seem familiar to you from a previous part of this conversation? There's one that says primary research, and then there are ones that are blogs. So it is pointing out to you the levels of evidence of that particular article, where that article falls on that triangle. So it's a very useful database, free for that purpose. It also allows you to link to full text. Now, what does that mean, and why is that not only important but vital to research competency? To be able to access research literature, you've got to be able to get it. Once you even find that you found an article that you want, now how do you get your hands on it? You're going to have to get it some way. To get it free and quickly on the spot, you want to be able to access the full text. Articles that are published as open access means that you can download that full article for free right then and there. Other articles you have to pay for if you want to download it right then and there. So you're going to want to look for access articles that are open. And how do you find them? So again, here's where your library membership or your librarian can help. So let's say we found a really good article that we would like to be able to download right now. If you have a library membership, the librarian can maybe download the article for you. Now I said don't use Google or Bing, but here is another place. I mean, I've been plenty of times there's an article. It's available, but I can't access it easily. So and I don't want to pay the arm and the leg in that moment. So I'm doing all the little workarounds to try to find it. So again, librarian, you go to Google and you get the title of the article and you just Google that, because somewhere someone may have archived that article and you can download it indirectly through them. For example, authors will do that, and if the author has their own web page, sometimes they will have their articles that they've published archived there that you can download. So that trying to find them through Google or Bing is a useful strategy. And then if you have time, you could find the email of the author, and in the old days we would write letters. But we would write the author and praise them for their article, and they are more than happy. If someone's reading their work, they're more than happy to share it. So they can send you a reprint of that. And lastly, the ones that aren't free, do you have a department budget that can help you access articles? Okay, so we've done a fair amount on this road together. We've identified differences between types of research approaches. We looked at qualitative, quantitative. I discussed how they come together as mixed. And then we've talked a little bit about big data. And then we've looked at the level of quality, robustness, and the levels of evidence. And then I've given you some strategies for finding and accessing research articles, summarizing it there through professional organizations, librarians, libraries, table of content alerts, and the various ways of searching online databases. I hope this has been helpful. We're not there yet, but this would be a good time for another break. So I will pause just a bit and then proceed on to the next part of this presentation. This is the part where you say, okay, I've dabbled a little bit in these databases. You know, that one search you just showed had 2,517. How on earth am I going to read all of these things to know if they're helpful for me? So now we're going to look at that. The research enterprise creates well over 1 million new articles every year. And in any given health specialty, this could mean needing to keep up with tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of articles a year. And although the number of evidence-based chaplaincy articles published each year is perhaps still manageable, the task of keeping up can easily get out of hand if one starts adding in, which I'm suggesting you do, searching the medical, the nursing, the social work, and other related professional literatures for studies that are relevant to providing spiritual care. So what's a chaplain to do? Physicians often need to speed read an article. And the way they do that is they glean to get the gist of it, and then they're quickly determining if they need to read the entire article or not. And so I'm wanting to teach you the method of speed reading a research article. It's 5 steps. You're going to read the title. You're going to read the abstract. You're going to be really clear on what the purpose of the study is. You're going to look at all the figures in the tables, and then you'll go back and reread the abstract. That will give you so much that you may not need to read it further, or you may be invited because of that. This is what I really want to dive into deeper. So let's practice. Well, we'll practice later, but let's go through each one of these in more detail. So you're going to read the title, and you're reading to see, is it descriptive enough to give you enough of an idea of what it's about, and does it capture your attention? Is it relevant? And then you're going to read the abstract to get a sense of the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, and what they found. Next, you're going to figure out the purpose of the study, and there's a hint on how to do that. You're going to look at the last paragraph before the methods section, and if it's not there, it'll be somewhere close by. Now wait a minute, I've just talked about methods section. So this is another side trip for on our major road trip. We're going to just do a little detour and do a little sightseeing about how research papers are structured. In general, research articles are structured uniformly. There's the abstract, there's the background, or sometimes it's called the introduction, or sometimes even called the context, followed by a methods section, the results and the findings, and then conclusions and discussions. So let's take each of those. Let's start with the abstract. Abstracts themselves can be structured. That is, I'm imagining you can't really see this in all the detail, but it has you may see the sort of brownish, reddish highlighted areas. This is telling you the first one says background, the second one says method, the second says results and conclusions. So the abstract itself is a little miniature version, is a micro version of the macro paper. That's the structure of the abstract, reflecting the structure of the article. However, some abstracts can also be unstructured, like the one that I've just posted on the left. All you can see is abstract and a lot of text. However, if you were to read through the text, I guarantee you it would unfold in the same form as the structure. So the structure is there, it's just not labeled as such. So there's the abstract. Then there's the background or the introduction section, and its whole goal is to determine, to expose what we already know about a subject and what's important to know. What else do we need to know, and more importantly, why is that important? It's making a justification for this work based on what's previously known. I mentioned that you can always find the purpose in this section. It's usually stated in the last paragraph right before the method. Not sure why that is, just convention, I guess, at this point. Occasionally you'll find it elsewhere, but for the most part, remember, if you're speed reading, you're going to take your eyes there first and look for it there. In the methods section, the methods are the specific design strategies that are used, how they chose participants, what kind of data they collected, and how they analyzed it. This is where understanding the different types of research, qualitative, quantitative, mixed, is helpful. Because the particular purpose of that research, be it qualitative, quantitative, mixed, whatever, will guide the particular design of how to collect and the kind of data to collect and who to choose. So the methods will tell you all about that. And then the results and findings. So they've collected their data, they've run their analyses or their interpretations. What did they find? This is where you'll find tables and figures most of the time. And then lastly, the conclusions and the discussion. This is how they're now making meaning out of what they found. And also a good place to identify the limitations of the findings. So, for example, they would say in a qualitative study, the limitations of the study is that the results are not generalizable. However, we feel that we have new ideas to consider exploring in greater depth in future research. So that would be an example of a conclusion. So this is how articles are structured. So let's get back now to our trip and our speed reading. So I said, figure out the purpose of the study. You're going to look in the last paragraph in the background, right before the methods section. And if it's not around there, it's going to be close by. Next, we're moving to reading the figures and tables. A good study will summarize all the important results visually, graphically, or in tables. If you are looking at a study and you're just looking at the figures and tables and you see one particular table that is loaded with numbers, please don't let that intimidate you. I have a master's in public health with an emphasis in biostatistics, and I can even get intimidated by some tables because it's just how the author decided to visualize the data in ways that may not be so intuitively available, but don't let that intimidate you. My husband, I have to have a little side story because this is how I demystified research things for myself. But my husband is an artist, educated artist, a professor, and when we first got together, I love art, but I spent my formative years in the sciences, and so I felt so intimidated going to museums or looking at works of art because he had such a vocabulary and a capacity to see things, and I didn't know what I was looking at. So I was intimidated, and his approach to me was, don't be intimidated, just start taking what you can see. So for example, with this big mural here, how is the artist dealing with color? So pick one thing, color, and just look at how color works in this piece. So I'm going to suggest you do that with those complicated looking tables of numbers. Don't let it intimidate you. Start seeing, well, what patterns are here? What can I understand? What does speak to me here? What can I track? So don't let it intimidate you. In future webinars, perhaps we'll have more in terms of how to really make meaning of numbers across different particular statistical tools. But don't let it intimidate you. Now, not all studies will actually have tables, particularly qualitative studies. In that case, you'll just have to look at the headings. The results sections might be divided up in sections, so in headings, subheadings, so those might be the equivalent of creating a table for you. And then you reread the abstract. This is to allow you to consolidate what you've gleaned from previous steps. And you've done it. That's the speed reading. We have now ended our journey in terms of basic instrumental skill sets. Now, how are we going to start integrating all of this as one's practice? Again, this might be a good time for a break because we're nearing the end of the webinar. We'll have one more section, and I'll start that now. So let's begin to try out what we've learned. So let's create a scenario, and it's this one. On interdisciplinary rounds this morning, I know that we'll be discussing 3 patients who have dementia. And one in particular is scheduled for discharge, but the social worker is having problems getting the patient's family to go along with placement in a SNF, in a skilled nursing facility. Now, let's say it's you now. You visited that patient earlier, at which time the patient's partner shared with you their fears that all hope would be diminished if their loved one had to go to a nursing home. So you and I, we're interested in knowing the latest research regarding spiritual care for people or caregivers of people with dementia. Now, rounds are going to start in about a half an hour. I don't have a lot of time. I'd like to be able to have something to be able to enlighten the team on rounds about new ways of thinking about that one patient in particular. Where on earth do I start? Well, we need to find an article. Because we have a time crunch, we're not going to just go to the professional websites or call up our librarian or do a table of contents search. We might, but we'll get bigger bang for our buck in a shorter period of time by going to search an online database. So let's go to PubMed. I know that I'm interested in the idea of dementia and spirituality, so I put those search terms in the box, spiritual and dementia. With more practice, I will learn better search terms, but I've strapped for time, and let's just see what this shows me. So I get 111 results at first. But remember, I am a little bit crunched for time, so I want to make sure I can download the article now. So I looked to the left of that search and found something that said free full text. I clicked on it, and as it was checked, it now eliminated down to 15 articles that I could get to read and inform me a little bit about spirituality and dementia. The clock is ticking, so I begin to read the titles. Same way as if I'm already starting to speed read. Are the titles descriptive enough to give me a good idea of what it's about and capture my attention? And as I begin to look, I see the second one says, Living Well with Dementia, Enhancing Dignity and Quality of Life, Using a Novel Intervention, Dignity Therapy. This sounds interesting. My attention is captured. I click on it. It does tell me that it has a full text link, so I'm excited about that. I click on the full text link. I also want to point out what's in the yellow circle that's now highlighted. It says EPUB ahead of print, and I get a little nervous. I get a little nervous because when I click on it, thinking that I could get it for free, It turns out it's not free yet. That EPUB ahead of print means, well, it might be free to download once it comes out in print, but beforehand, I'm going to have to pay for it. And these articles can be pricey. You can rent the article, that is, you can just read it online for a minimal amount of time, in this case 48 hours, for $6. Or if I really wanted to have my own version of it, to be able to print, make other copies of it, it's going to cost me $38. And these are lower prices now. They've gone up $40, $50 easily for that. So you don't want to be able to spend money that freely. It's when you can find other articles as well. So let's try again. So as I look again, I find another one that says Hope and Connection. I'm interested in it. I read the title, Hope and Connection, the experience of family caregivers of persons with dementia living in a long-term care facility. Now by now, I hope you have actually downloaded that article because it was a part of the instructions for starting this webinar. And I hope you haven't read it in advance because I'm going to teach you how to speed read this article. And if you already read it in advance, you'll still appreciate this process using even if you've read it before. So the title is descriptive. It gives me a good idea of what it's about. It captures my attention. It seems to be relevant to what I want. So I am going to now read the article. First, by reading the abstract to get a sense of the who, the what, the when, the where, how, and what they found. So this is another good time to pause if you are going to now practice speed reading this article and read the abstract and see if you can answer the who, the what, etc. I'm going to invite you to pause, and I'm now going to move forward. So in this case, the who were 13 family caregivers of residents in a long-term care facility who had dementia. So I'm thinking now about the one patient that the social worker is having some trouble with. What they found was they looked at these caregivers' expectations of hope. And the particular where were, again, people in long-term care facilities. The how did they get this information? They did open-ended, face-to-face interviews, which they analyzed using an interpretive descriptive approach looking for hope-related themes. And what did they find? That there's a connection between hope and being connected to family. That's the abstract. The method, by the way, reminds you that this is qualitative. Small sample size, 13 caregivers getting their stories, trying to discover ideas about what it means for their loved one with dementia to be in a long-term care facility, to discover new ideas about that. So we're not going to be able to hint, we're not going to be able to generalize, but more about that later. So now we're going to see the third part of speed reading is figuring out the purpose of the study. And again, the last paragraph before the method section. In this one it says, thus, the purpose of the study was to explore the hope of family caregivers of persons with dementia residing in a long-term care facility. I understand the purpose. It really matches a lot that might help us understand more what's going on with the family of the patient that the social worker is concerned about. So now we're going to read all the figures and tables in this article. Again, I invite you to pause to do that. Just remembering that a good study summarizes all the important results using figures and tables, and most of the time, Table 1 summarizes the demographic information about the study sample. So I invite you to look at the Table 1 of this article, and sure enough, it's just describing the participants. And remember, the participants were the caregivers, not of the patients themselves. So take a moment and look at the table and see what you see. I recommend that you pause because I'm going to move forward, but do take a guess yourself of some patterns you may see. One thing that strikes me is even though I'm not going to try to generalize across larger populations, I do want to know, is it the ideas that came out of this study, that were generated from this study, are they in the ballpark with the patients that I'm seeing? So look at the caregiver. How old was the caregiver? Well, the mean was around 67, and yes, for that particular patient, that's around the caregiver age. And education in years, I don't quite know that, but I begin looking at the gender of the caregiver, and that kind of matches. And this is a city, so yeah, this kind of matches a bit. And look, and when I see the caregiver's ethnic origin, I see that this was an entire white population. Well, I'm not put off quite yet, because that particular patient's family, patient and family, identify as white. So this, I may have an idea that's relevant to them, that they can agree with it, has some sort of, they understand in some way. If, for example, my patient was different in many, many ways, by race, by their marital status, et cetera, then I might not want to go take too much out of this, but other than to generate my own ideas about, well, how would I ask this question of a different group of people? But anyway, this is again how I would start thinking about integrating this. I get that this table represents a patient population that that's useful for me in my need for the interdisciplinary team. So then you want to read all the figures and tables, but I remember I mentioned that not all studies will have them, particularly qualitative studies. And in that case, you would start looking at the headings in the results section. So take a minute to now look at that paper in the results section, and you'll see the subheadings, which I have also listed here. When they're trying to describe hope, these are the things, the themes that came out. Hope and connection, accepting where we are, living life in the moment, believing in something, standing together, and balancing dual worlds. So now I want to go, last step is go back and reread the abstract. And I have a good sense now that there's something in this article that might be useful. I look at the clock. I have a few more minutes. I read it in a little bit greater detail as I'm heading up to the unit to begin interdisciplinary round. So now we're back to our scenario. They're about to start, and as the team readies itself to visit the patient whose family was concerned about nursing home, our social worker then expresses to the team the concerns about discharge planning for the patient, because of the patient's profound cognitive disability really needs to be in a more skilled nursing facility. And the family just is not there yet. So remember, you had also had a relationship with the family. So during rounds, how might you share with the team what you found from that article? Given its limits, it's a qualitative study, but how might you still share what you found in the literature? Again, pause, particularly if you're doing this with a group of people, and have a conversation about how you might share. And I'm about to move forward with an example of how I might share. Possible response would be, I just read an article in BMC Geriatrics, a journal, that might be helpful here. It was a qualitative study on caregivers of patients with dementia in long-term care facilities, and they were exploring how staying connected might be an important factor for maintaining hope. So since I know this is a concern for that family, maybe you, speaking to the social worker, maybe you and I can have a conversation with them exploring hope and how they can stay connected. That might help them in deciding about SNF placement. So here's how I've just taken a quick read of an article, brought it into my practice, and found ways that I could collaborate with a team member to have a conversation, to explore this idea and help make meaning further. And how then might you use this scenario to demonstrate research competency? This is an invitation for you to begin practicing everything that has preceded this particular slide. And over time now, how might you then demonstrate your research competency? To meet the ITP Competency 6, you need to demonstrate through examples how you are integrating current research literature into your spiritual care practice and how you can work with your interdisciplinary team members. You also want to identify research that you've read or, fortunate you if you've participated in, and how you've shared key findings with peers and other colleagues. I would offer that the way to do that is to begin this as part of your spiritual care practice and practice and practice. Begin a practice of keeping up with the literature relevant to your work as a spiritual caregiver, particularly if you have an area of specialization, a particular type of unit that you work on, you see a pattern of a particular kind of spiritual needs across particular illnesses or disease presentations. So begin a practice of keeping up with that literature. You now have some skills to do that. Hone it when you're looking at professional journals. Find those specific journals that are useful and subscribe to their table of contents. From time to time, do literature searches on particular problems. This is that first bullet point. Just begin practicing. Then begin practicing sharing what you found during interdisciplinary rounds or in general with conversation with team members or with other chaplains. And this is an invitation to begin to cultivate a community of practice, a community of inquiry around these sorts of things, and begin to work together and to support each other as you grow in your research competency. So once you're used to articulating this, you're able to then meet one of the other criteria for demonstrating your competency, because maybe in the interview you're asked about that. Also, you're asked to write narratives, and perhaps you may write a verbatim or a case study. So when you're asked to write about these things, particularly when you're asked to write about where you may have used research literature, remember this scenario. And you would include that in their narrative, that scenario, citing the particular article, and perhaps some of the other articles. You'll go back later and read more articles on spirituality and dementia, and be able to include that as a citation in whatever you're writing up for your essays or narrative pieces, etc. So, what a trip, which I've enjoyed thoroughly. It's a blessing to be able to have done this with you. My only regret is that I don't see each of you individually, but I feel your presence, and it is my heartfelt wish that any information and knowledge that you've gained from this will be able to serve you in providing greater service to others. There are a few resources here. There are lots that are out there. The original webinar included these, and these are still good places to start. If you want to have a really good, solid overview of different types of research, then go to the research handbook that was originally, I hope this URL, I should have checked it, but you can find the Chaplaincy Research Handbook. I know you can find it on the transformingchaplaincy.org website, but there's a handbook there. And please do utilize the PubMed resources, the tutorials, and there's a particular one on primary data methods that's useful and accessible. And then that article that I mentioned in the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy that talks about the top journals. And then lastly, those are the databases that we covered in this webinar, PubMed and TRIP. Thank you, and I wish you well.
Thank you, LaVera, for a very informative and interesting presentation. And I wish all listeners much enjoyment from working through the ideas and suggestions that LaVera has put forward in today's session. And thank you once again, and God bless you all.